gave us the sign.
Yes. All right.
Okay.
Hey, everybody. Gonna get started in just a minute. By a minute, I mean like more like 10 seconds. All right. So, good to see everybody again. I guess welcome to the After Times. This is the first conference that I've been back to since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it feels really good to be back. So let's talk about 2021 this year, aka 2020 Part 2. 2020 was a little bit sparse on stories. It seemed like 2021, everybody got their energy level back and was able to cover a lot of cyber stuff, and sometimes not in the greatest way. And at this point, I guess Mark Zuckerberg is sort of a recurring mascot in these kind of roasts. All right, so who are we? For any of you that have not seen this talk before, Yael, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, so hi everybody, this is part 3. This is our third talk, and I am Yael. I'm a journalist, and I guess probably half of my work is distilling really complicated technical stuff to make it accessible to normal people, ideally without losing any nuance. And the other half is investigative reporting. And I started doing these talks because I'm sort of terrified about having a big journalism fail. So I thought I would just kind of try to learn from other people's mistakes.
And I'm David Huerta. I'm a digital security trainer over at Freedom of the Press Foundation, and I help journalists learn about how the internet works and how technology works and how it could be used to spy on them and to help them have it not spy on them. I also sometimes write. It's something I do on the side, so I've written for a few publications here and there, and dropped out of ASU in 2010 to co-found HeatSync, which is a hackerspace right here in Mesa. It's down the street. You should go check it out at some point. All right, so welcome all. Good to see you all in person. Good to see you all in cyberspace. Here's what we got on the grill, of course, slathered with sweet baby rays.
Okay, so today we are only looking at news articles, even though there are a lot of really terrible op-eds.
So many.
Yes. There's a lot of marketing materials published by brands that are kind of potentially misleading, and a lot of broadcast news and audio that we don't like. But, we only have an hour, so we're going to stick to just news articles.
All right, so just some gentle reminders. Bad article doesn't mean the author is bad every time. A bad author doesn't mean the publication is bad every time. Bad publication doesn't mean the industry is bad every time. We actually like journalists, and we kind of understand it's like, hey, even your favorite restaurant will give you a tummy ache every now and then. So just something to keep in mind. And we, in many cases, source all these stories from our own media diets. You'll see, we're not specifically calling out any specific publication because it's holistically bad, so much as just it happened to be on our radar because we like reading them generally, or go out of our way to read them. Sometimes hate read them, but that's another story. We'd like to focus on ways that both journalists and hackers can do better. Is kind of the TLDR of this. And this year we have themes. Yael, you have some details on this.
Yeah, so we actually spent a whole year looking at stories that we thought might be bad, and there were so many of them that we kind of divided them into different themes. And the first theme is try reading the privacy policy in terms of service. And that doesn't mean that everything that we picked out would have been better if people had done that, but we do see it as a best practice. You have to read the fine print, you have to compare the fine print, use diff check sometimes to kind of figure those things out. And I'm a little nervous about this because this is one of my favorite journalists for one of my favorite sites. And I don't actually think that this was his fault, which I'll go into later, but there was an article in Ars Technica about WhatsApp giving users an ultimatum that they had to share data with Facebook or stop using the app. And this is the reason the article was written is because WhatsApp had this pop-up saying oh, agree to these new changes, but they weren't actually new changes. There was actually no change in how they shared and provided data with Facebook, and this was a practice that had been in place since 2016. I think there was some tiny changes to how you interact with businesses using Facebook and WhatsApp, but I see this as a messaging fail on WhatsApp's fault because users thought they had an opt-out option that hadn't existed for many years. There was one story that got it right, and that was another favorite writer for another favorite site. And it was Lily Hay Newman, who's awesome. But one thing I did notice is that her story came out a few days afterwards. So I think part of the issue is that there's sites like Ars Technica and The Verge where they make people write a story a day, which I can't even imagine writing that often. And sometimes it takes a couple days to figure out what's going on. So the actual data sharing I see as a fail, and I'm gonna kind of put a line in the sand and say that if you are a company and you're not comfortable saying what you actually do and who you share data with, then you should not be sharing it. And they also didn't go on the record, and that's another line in the sand. If you are a PR person or comms, or if you are a company, you should be able to describe your policy and your changes clearly to the media. And there's been a little bit of a movement with The Verge and some other sites saying we don't want to talk to PR people off the record. We want to be able to quote you. And so sometimes going on background can be really helpful for a journalist, but I can also see why people don't want to do that, because sometimes comms people lie to journalists. So your article ends up being wrong because you were lied to by somebody that you cannot quote. Because it was on background. So, and then the other issue I see is that Wired, like there was, WhatsApp wrote a statement to kind of clarify some information, and so Wired, which doesn't publish as often as Ars Technica, had the time to kind of process it and look at the terms of service in that information, and I think that that's why it did better. To their credit, Ars Technica did publish like a short update on the bottom with some on-background information that helped clarify a little more, but I see it as kind of a fail in the industry where like there's a big change and people are writing different things about it. You don't really know what's going on until a few days later, and I don't think this is just a journalism fail. I think it's like the whole ecosystem.
So this next story is from, I think, Fospost, which happens to have a very, very similar logo to foreign policy, which always throws me off. So this article has a very spicy headline: Audacity is now possible spyware, and remove it ASAP. So there's a few issues that we kind of found with this. One is that in this case, there's definitions to spyware. There's definitions that vary a little bit, but largely are like harmonized between AV vendors and that industry holistically. And there's certain things that, you know, that is categorized by, and in this case, what Audacity was doing with its kind of telemetrics collection and, you know, the fact that it has to connect to a server and thus reveal an IP address to receive updates would barely, in my opinion, basically, in my opinion anyway, barely warrants as a potentially unwanted program or a PUP. Audacity's analytics collection in this case, yeah, it's pretty normal for most, I guess, commercial / like normie software. Like, yes, you wouldn't expect like the Linux kernel to have like Google Analytics in it for some reason, but like in this case with, you know, if you use a lot of software, it will include that kind of thing entailing it. So, and yeah, and this is pretty common. Like Adobe Suite would do as much as Audacity is doing now, so would Windows by default. And so there was another kind of article that talked a little bit about this with a little bit more nuance in terms of just saying like, no, this isn't actually spyware. Like it's just adding some new metrics for things. And so this is a problem on a few different levels. In this case, from the company side, which was the company that bought Audacity, it's still open source, but it's you know, owned by, I forget what the actual name of it was called. And most of these kind of policies tend to be heavily influenced by lawyers. You know, they want to cover their ground as much as they can to remove the possibility they might get sued for something. And in this case, a lot of open source users have different expectations and a different culture regarding privacy, which is probably good. But in this case, you know, they wouldn't be exactly the kind of crowd that would call Windows and Adobe Suite spyware. So there is a little bit of nuance there. It's like almost like, well, you're speaking to a specific audience, and this makes sense to that audience, I guess. And this is similar to, or at least an echo to 2012, when Ubuntu started including Amazon.com searches in their like application search bar. Cool.
Okay, so our favorite app, Clubhouse. Okay, that was a joke. There was an article on BBC about Clubhouse knocked offline in China. But it said that Clubhouse didn't record conversations, but we know that Clubhouse does record conversations. And it also shares the audio if it has to, for legally. But it does delete the conversations after the session has ended if there weren't any complaints. And people like really freaked out about this on Twitter. And I'm like, did BBC not read the terms of service? Because if they had read it, they would clearly see that audio is recorded but not kept. And then people like went on Twitter, they were really upset, and they were like, this says it doesn't record, but it does. And having been in the position where somebody's saying there's an error and I'm trying to figure out was there actually an error or not, the people on Twitter who were like ranting and raving about it did not say, oh yeah, but it's also deleted if there wasn't a complaint. And the story wasn't updated until a week later, which I see as a fail because I think you should make like changes as quickly as you can. But I also think that people freaking out and not sharing all the details makes it a lot harder for journalists to go back and be like, was there an error or wasn't there? So that was that one. And then this leads us to our next theme, which is don't just believe the press release, do actual research. Because sometimes companies, believe it or not, will send out press releases that kind of have statistics that have the potential of being misleading or maybe are wrong. And so like a lot of errors that I see, not just this year, but every year, is that people will just kind of flat out republish a press release, and that's bad journalism. So you should actually do research instead.
So the first example we have for this, a story about quantum computing, and in this case, it's founding a weakness that imperils encryption from this Swiss company. So there's this is a specific genre. It's pretty common to see for a lot of the kind of like WhatsApp is hacked type stories, but now we're seeing it with other things as well. This is an example with quantum computing, and in this case, this is one of those kind of big if true stories, and maybe the thing to look at is to see whether or not it is true. So there's already the idea of like quantum computing breaking encryption algorithms, elliptical curve based encryption, like prime factoring based encryption, is not exactly new. It's like NIST is already working on stuff for that. But you kind of see like the gaps in this story. Where it's like, hey, we quoted an expert. They said like it's a big if true, but I need to see details on the research. Yes, I am James Jonah Jameson. I want to see pictures of Spider-Man / like scientific research on this breakthrough. And when you and like from a reporting side of things, like if you have something that seems like a big claim, like the kind of mental exercise that I would recommend is like pretend that the person that you're talking to, the PR person, is like a rando on a message board that is saying that you will revolutionize the electrical industry by saying you have free energy from like crystals or whatever. Just like start thinking skeptically. And yeah, again, knowing the background of just like is this actually news in terms of just like the idea that cryptography might be broken based on what quantum computers can do. And there are some like developments that are worth keeping track of in that space. The IEEE Spectrum, which I don't actually have quoted here, but has some articles around the idea of scalable error checking, which has been a challenge with quantum computing, is something that is being worked on, but that also right now isn't a thing because that also requires like more computational energy, more qubits to make that work. So if that were to be like solved, that'd be a pretty substantial big deal claim. And if you have big deal claims, to bring in our boy Carl Sagan, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Billions and billions of bad stories. There you go.
Okay. Yes, the security researchers contacted didn't say POC GTFO, which is a really good book. I have all three of them, even though I don't understand most of it. Okay, so this is a topic near and dear to my heart. This is a story in our local paper about Chandler exploring mobile voting with a company called Votes. Could that help address election skepticism? And this article, I don't know if you guys know the story, but there were some MIT researchers that found some really serious flaws in Votes. It was really good, credible research that Votes discounted, and then they helped to pay to commission an audit by Trail of Bits, which is a really well-regarded security firm, and they found the exact same issues that these researchers did. And yet, Votes keeps kind of, I think it's probably borderline slandering these researchers. They just keep going around being like, oh, this study was rigged, they were using an old version, to the point where these researchers have an FAQ page that kind of debunks all of those. So flash forward to Chandler exploring this app. In this article, they quoted from Votes' website that pushed back on MIT research, and they kind of did both. So it's like, oh, they quoted the research, and then they quoted the response to it. And of course, they didn't mention, like, oh, yeah, but by the way, this was all backed up by a different firm, probably because they didn't know. So I feel like Votes' claims weren't rigorously fact-checked. They did contact a Votes spokesperson, but they didn't reach out to the researchers for comment. So I think even if you are quoting from two different documents, like if there are allegations, you absolutely have to call that person. And I don't know for sure, but I imagine the research would be like, oh yeah, we have an FAQ page, and also this was backed up by an independent audit. I feel like there was a little bit of both sides of them, but I also, these are local beat reporters, so they're not like knee-deep in Votes drama in the hacking space as I am. They don't know that Votes went to the Supreme Court to argue in favor of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and so that's stuff that I kind of know. So, I wrote insider knowledge is hard though, and I've been kind of DMing people links as they write these stories, being like, oh, by the way, here's some more background that you don't know, and you might think I'm really smart, or you might think I'm completely nuts, but check out these links here. So.
All right, and this next story comes from The Guardian. In this case, it's about, what passwords are terrible. We should rethink this. And I'll be honest, the first time I read this story, or at least 3/4 of the way through, I'm like, this is fine, I don't understand. This is a very relatable protagonist, lost Bitcoin because of a hard drive crash, RIP. And, thinks passwords should go away. I'm like, yes, I agree. And then it's like, wait, what's going on? And it starts going into this weird kind of direction about biometrics and complete total surveillance of your movements. So in this case, biometrics are not magic, and that's something that I think this audience would be pretty well familiar with in terms of seeing demos on how to thwart Face ID with printouts, or how to thwart fingerprint readers with gummy bears, for example. Or in case if you haven't seen Tika Brain Soriamatu's Unfit Bits, that was an interesting art installation that faked Fitbit data based with metronomes and power drills and bike wheels and stuff like that, which was being a thing that was collected by insurance companies. So there's also this kind of whole trail of this company that's founded by former Israeli intelligence person, and being hey, we can identify people completely based on things like their the way they move things, how often, their gaits, which is the way they walk, and a lot of these other things. I'm like, are you sure this is the thing you want instead of just using one password? So that's a little bit of an issue there, and it seemed to have kind of a largely uncritical approach to it, because it's literally describing sort of the world building to a Cory Doctorow novel. It's literally the gate tracking in Little Brother. It's hey, what if we use that to identify you online so you can never anonymously whistleblow ever again? I'm like, maybe we should talk about that part. And honestly, I think it started getting into it. It's there's password managers, you can use that, but people don't want to get it. I'm like, no, go back to that. Go back to that part. Tell us about password managers, says David Huerta every single sentence all the time. All right, next theme.
Okay, so this is one that I think a lot of journalists get wrong, and part of it is because we have tight deadlines, and it's oh no, I need to get somebody to quote on this thing. I'm going to call everybody I know. But if you are writing a story that about a specific subsection or of tech, you need to make sure your expert has expertise in that domain, because otherwise they're going to say dumb things, and you're going to publish them and look dumb, and the public is it's just bad. So. Sometimes you might say, I need some extra time on this because I haven't gotten the right person to bounce this off of. So, and I think part of the problem too is that a lot of hackers won't talk to journalists because journalists are evil. But basically they're journalists get stuff wrong, so we're not going to talk to them. But there's, room for people to maybe get stuff right if you do talk to them. So that's kind of my opinion on that.
Yeah, it's either they talk to you or they talk to the Votes guy. So, something to think about. So, all right. So for anybody that remembers this Choice Classic from 2018, the Bloomberg story about, chips from China the size of a grain of rice being embedded into motherboards, they didn't retract that. They doubled down on that a little bit more, and they kind of dug their heels in and say, like, we got more in terms of that story. And so this is a sequel to that long hack, How China Exploited U.S. Tech Supplier. And this is, kind of talks a little bit, like, in the original story, too, I thought, like, there were hints at what is probably an interesting, cool story with more facts and more evidence. But this is kind of a little bit of that, too, where you kind of see the contours of what could be a story about implants being used in the same way that, like, the NSA, TAO team does, as we know from the, like, Snowden hacks, from the Snowden documents. And it seemed like there is a possibility of that, but then it seemed like they talked to a lot of people that were a little bit away from the tech and maybe were filling in the gaps of their knowledge with what they imagined to be the case, which is why you end up with kind of these weird, inconsistent stories behind, like, this mentions, like, oh, yes, there's chips that are embedded in a grain of rice. It looks like a transistor, and other people saying, like, oh, it's the BIOS chip, actually. And there's a few things that they cite as evidence but don't show. So in this case, there's like, hey, we confirmed this in corporate documents. I'm like, cool. Can I see them? Like, can I have those? That'd be cool. There's also some audits that were referred to, but again, those are not really included, or not. There's not really much detail in that. So in this case, there was a specific kind of assumption that was made based on the idea. It's like, hey, we found malicious code in these specific BIOS chips, basically, within different supermicro servers. And because they were from different machines at different times, thus they must have been applied at the factory, which if anybody has ever installed OpenWRT on the router, you know that you don't have to, like, have the same firmware on the device that was shipped to you. You can change it to something else. So this is, I think, an important detail that was kind of missed. Because I could see, like, the real story being that, like, actually this server is being, like, intercepted mid-shipment someplace somewhere in the supply chain, and that, there is a specific targeted BIOS chip set of BIOS chips that is being flashed, knowing who the end, like, client is going to be. And I would like to see them investigate more into that direction, but unfortunately that's not really where they went. They basically just kind of doubled down on being like, well, we cited all these, like, top government officials who maybe don't exactly know how computers work. And there was a little bit of that from Pulling All of the Things, kind of discussing some of the, kind of connecting the dots of just like, hey, maybe the person that they're sourcing is not necessarily kind of tech savvy enough to know the specifics of how this is actually being pulled off, if it's happening. Yeah, so this is the thing. It's like, I do, like, my gut feeling in my heart of hearts is that there's probably there has been some sort of implant story that has happened at some point that is ready to be told, but in this case isn't, or at least kind of like not going in that specific direction. So I would, like, if available, like, the thing that I would love to see is, like, well, if we have infected BIOS chips, like, let's take a look at them, let's decap them, let's have the experts actually look into one of these chips and see what they find, and then publish that. All right.
Okay. This was a weird one. This was, China appears to warn India, push too hard and the lights could go out. There was a power outage and it looked like a warning. And this is one of the ones that I'm like, did this happen or not happen? And I talked to people who were kind of experts in the region, and they were like, no, there wasn't any real indication that this was a signal. And so maybe it was, and I'm wrong, but I don't know. Like, once the dust settled, the local papers said, oh, yeah, this was due to human error, not a cyber attack. So maybe it was a cyber attack, and they were coerced into changing their story. But I think it probably wasn't. And this was writing based on a report, and the report itself said the link is unsubstantiated. And I was kind of surprised because New York Times has a bit of a reputation of taking people's stories and not giving them attribution, because they will re-interview everybody to make sure the story got it right. And they didn't do that here. They did link to a report. And it was updated 7 months later, so I'm not really sure. Because at first I was like, maybe they had to wait for the dust to settle to get the story right. But it was updated, and people are still saying it's wrong. So I don't know. It's a little bit of a weird one. Like when you're citing from a long report, maybe try to verify that better or something. And the next thing that our advice, our best practice, is to make sure you're really clear on the details. And this was a story in the record. Israeli government raids NSO group office. But did they raid them? Because they said they visited them, and the visit was pre-planned. You don't usually pre-plan a raid.
It was a Twitch raid.
A Twitch raid, right? The word raid was used over and over again in the story, but an NSO spokesman used the word visited. So I'm like, was it a raid? Was it an inspection? Was it a document audit? Was it a formal meeting? Who knows? And I think like somebody on Twitter said, oh, I used the word raid, but it was a mistranslation, or an earlier report got it wrong and they just changed it. So I think that that's a possibility, or it could just be sensationalism. And I hate to be, a lot of times people will say like, oh, this is clickbait, and most people do not get paid by the click anymore. It's usually based on subscriptions, and you want to build, believe it or not, journalists and news organizations do want to build credibility, so they don't want to have something wrong. Like they don't want to have clickbait and get called out on it. That's not a good way to build trust. So I don't want to accuse. This is all of our what went wrong are just pure speculation, but it is a possibility that like the word raid is sexier. So
Cool. This next story, Chelsea Manning is back and hacking again, only this time for Bitcoin-based privacy startup. So a little bit on this story is like we have at least one of these every year where somebody misinterprets how like Tor works, and this time it's kind of a double whammy. It's also misinterpreting how Tor works, but then also not totally having a full understanding of how blockchain works, which, I mean, who can blame them? So in this case, there's a few things that are cited here that talk a little bit about what is possibly referring to some specific Tor hacks that don't actually have so much to do with the Tor network so much as ways of breaching either darknet sites or hacking the Tor browser via Firefox exploits. So for any of you familiar with the Silk Road takedown, there was an FBI report about how I think there was a wired article about this, about how they basically looked at an issue with the CMS login to reveal what the actual IP address of the server was. And the same thing goes with a few other kind of like sites that were taken down, darknet sites, by the FBI using Firefox exploits in this case. With, back in 2014, it was kind of a thing with Firefox. There's also some mention of a 2020 Bitcoin attack with Tor nodes, but these have to do with malicious exit nodes doing SSL stripping. So it's not so much the Tor protocol and Tor data so much as it is just like any intermediary being a bad actor. And in this case, the kind of comparison is made. It's like, oh, Tor has all these problems ranging from its funding to its security issues. And it's not exactly a fair comparison, especially since NIM isn't real yet. It's a white paper. So it's not exactly an onions to onions comparison, as it were. And it's still something that would probably need some kind of front end, would probably need some sort of network infrastructure, and thus the same or similar attacks would also apply to NIM, which is an issue. It cites the use of mixed nets, as does the white paper to some degree. And the white paper goes into some more detail. Unfortunately, there's not really much article. There's not much in the article mentioning it's like, why are mixed nets good this time? Because this is something that people have tried in the 90s for anonymizing email, for example, that ended up just being like a wasteland of like spam relays. And it'd be nice to see like, hey, remember that idea that we had and why it was really bad in the 90s? This time it's different, but maybe ask here, like, why? Why is it different this time? So yeah, and that's the thing. It's like, I think there's a lot of interesting kind of complexities in the Tor network. So it's really easy to make mistakes reporting on it, unfortunately. But it is useful to like do a Google search on like what these things that are being referred to actually are. And then of course, like knowing how blockchains work, like what can they do, what can they not do? You know, what are their purpose and like what their kind of like, what is their ideal settings? Because something like NIM, for example, cannot replace Tor because of the fact that Tor is an anonymity network. NIM kind of requires you to essentially like pay for your route to anonymize yourself over to connect to the server. So it's really more like a replacement for Tor Onion services. Like you wouldn't be able to anonymously connect to the New York Times over NIM as it exists on the white paper, unless the New York Times were to like basically go out of their way and set up all this blockchain stuff. And every single one of their users had a like NIM wallet address. It's kind of like one of those things. It's like the practicality of cryptocurrency is if everybody can accept cryptocurrency and I can walk down Main Street in Mesa without anybody being able to accept Bitcoin, so is that really a practical answer? Is that really a comparison? Maybe not. So that being said also, like I love Chelsea, but like when you look for experts on things, like there's a lot of specialization that happens in a lot of our field. So talking to somebody that is kind of has like a broad knowledge of things is good, but then maybe also follow up by talking to somebody with a more deep and specialized knowledge in things like blockchain.
Oh, this is my favorite one.
ProPublica, oh no.
Yeah, I know, we're calling up ProPublica another one of my favorite sites. But this was a story about how Facebook undermined privacy protections for its 2 billion WhatsApp users. And it had some really good information. So that was what was so frustrating about this story, is that it could have been a really good story because it had a lot of great information on pen registers and trap and trace devices. So some of the reason why you might want to use Signal over WhatsApp if you are worried about targeted government surveillance, and also the challenges of moderation and scale. But it also kind of said like, oh, you know, WhatsApp is breaking privacy because if I send an abusive message to somebody and they report it, it's no longer end-to-end encrypted. Like that was kind of the implication. And I'm like, no, that's not, abuse report mechanisms are not a backdoor. If you send me a message and I show it to somebody else, that does not have anything to do with whether it was encrypted. And they eventually issued a clarification after like many cycles of the reporter getting defensive and telling people they were wrong on Twitter. So to me, I feel like there's two areas. Like ideally, your story would be right in the first place, but your second chance is if a lot of experts are pointing out that something is wrong, maybe like take a breath and listen to them. And they did eventually issue a clarification, but the headline remained. And it gets even worse. Not only are we calling out ProPublica, but we're calling out Ars Technica again, because Ars should know better. Like the writer of this story is a tech expert, and he's like, oh, WhatsApp end-to-end encrypted messages aren't that private after all, because if you report an abuse mechanism, then like they can see that. If I get a message and I report it as abuse, then a moderator will see it. Ooh, like, and it's like, it was very disappointing that Ars Technica did this copycat story. And again, the writer, like, I think Ars Technica has some of the smartest commenters in the industry, and again, he was doubling down and not kind of taking what they said at face value, and that was weird. And I think part of the issue here is that people really don't like Facebook. It's Meta now. It was Facebook when I wrote that. But people don't like Meta, and so therefore they don't trust WhatsApp. And I think you have to kind of watch your biases. Just because you don't like a company or they've done bad things or there's lots of room for criticism because of real things doesn't mean, you have to kind of watch that you're not implying bad or seeing bad things when they're not there, because I'm glad there's abuse report mechanisms. And I want to say there was maybe a lack of understanding of what end-to-end encryption is, which I think is definitely true for ProPublica. I'm hesitant to say that for ours because they really should know. They're really good at covering this. So I don't know, maybe it was just all the WhatsApp hate. And then we're going to talk about what we can do better, because again, like we kind of drew you in by being like, oh, we're going to talk about the worst stories, but throughout this talk, you probably realize it's an ecosystem issue, and it's not really just like these damn journalists getting things wrong. Like there's just a whole industry thing, and there's stuff that journalists and hackers and these companies can do better. Do's and don'ts for journalists. And I don't think that this will fix every one of these issues, but I do think it'll help. Yes, you have to read the documentation. You have to diff check the documentation. If you don't understand the changes, you have to run it by somebody who does. If you are going to call people out, you have to give them a chance to respond. It's not just like, oh, these researchers said this company did something bad, but the company said they're lying. Like, you have to actually talk to the people. When you get a claim from a company, from PR and spokesperson, you have to try to fact check it on your own, because sometimes they will leave out information or give you inaccurate information. Sometimes they don't even know. Like, a lot of companies that are really technical, the comms people aren't getting paid enough to understand how blockchain works. So sometimes you have to fact check it, and there's no malice involved. If you're reporting on speculation, I would just say tread really carefully there. And this is a thing for editors, because a lot of times people will blame writers for headlines, and usually editors write or rewrite the headlines. And a writer's not going to tell you that, because they're not going to throw their editor under the bus publicly. But if a headline does not match the reporting, like, I feel like editors should really run the headlines by the journalist first. And sometimes they do like A/B split testing and they see what pulls the most traffic. But like, I think you should really make sure it's accurate, because it's that journalist's credibility on the line. And if you want people to trust you and talk to you and read your reporting and take it seriously, like, you can't have headlines that are incorrect.
And of course, we also have some do's and don'ts for security researchers. If you are complaining about a piece publicly, go into detail on the why of why that is, and include some nuance in that criticism. So also, if you're going to speak as an expert on a particular subject, it's important to actually be an expert on that particular subject. Having an opinion is not the same thing as having facts.
And then comms teams, and I probably sound a little critical of comms, but there are some really excellent comms people. The ones that I like will not tell a lie, and I kind of learn who they are and try to ask for them or CC them when I'm talking to other comms people. But this is also true for companies. You have to build trust with the public, and it's through what you do, not how you spin things, because it does come out. If you are doing data sharing, like, be open and transparent. Like, I feel like there's this weird kind of facade where people are like, oh yeah, we have a privacy page and we explain some things, but people don't really understand what's going on. And then the last one is that I think it's okay to go on the record. Like, a lot of these companies are so risk averse that they're like, oh yeah, I'm a PR person and I will tell you what this does, but only secretly, and don't quote me on it. And like, sometimes there's a lot lost in that translation. So I think it's good to actually go on the record when possible, and just, be willing to put your name and that information behind it. And one thing I heard recently it was at a TROP conference, there was a comms person who was saying, like, if the company CEO is not willing to put their name on something, then I'm definitely not going to put my name on it. And I think that's the kind of pushback you have to give people internally.
Cool. So we're going to go ahead and open the floor to questions. We have these, like, apparently throwable microphones. So if you're okay with me throwing this, like, squishy microphone at you, feel free to raise your hand and I'll go ahead and do that.
Or we could just, if you don't want to have something thrown at you, we can just repeat your question.
I can also just, like, hold the microphone. Oh, yeah, good. Oh. I'll try. All right. Yes. Excellent catch.
Do you have to do anything? Speak and do it? Okay, perfect.
Oh, okay, cool.
Since you are some scribes, what do you think in the last few years, I'm curious how public records laws have been, statewide here anyway, and then also federally. Have they gotten worse? Do you see journalists using them in a better way?
Sorry, using what?
Sorry, FOIA and then state public records laws.
Oh, FOIA. Yeah.
I can talk on that a little bit.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I think in general, it is really hard. FOIA laws are really difficult. It's really difficult to get information that you want using FOIA and public records requests. I don't know if it's gotten worse or better. It's kind of hard to tell overall because there's so many different agencies that you can FOIA. But I haven't heard anybody say like, oh, this is easy to do now. There is a really cool nonprofit called the Gumshoe Group that will hook you up with an attorney. Sometimes you have to like apply, and they helped me get a bunch of data from the Phoenix Police Department actually, that they were not going to give me until a lawyer drafted a letter and like kind of made motions that you would need to do like towards a lawsuit. But yeah, there's a lot of cool people. Like one of the best things I've done is like hook up with Muckrock and like other journalists. Jason Leopold has helped me a lot. Just like, what do you do when they won't give you this data? Like, what do I say next and how do I get it? And so like, it's an annoying, time-consuming thing, but yeah, it's cool that we have a community of people willing to help each other on it. But yeah, I don't know if it's gotten worse or better. I have seen some good journalism based on it, so that's really cool. That's good to see. So yeah, it's one of those things that should work better than it does.
It also takes a long time, and it sometimes leads to like awkward situations. Like, why did we just get a letter from the CIA? And it's like, oh yeah, so-and-so was an intern like a year ago, made a FOIA request. And then it's just like, okay, our co-working space people are like a little bit like raising an eyebrow on that, but that's fine. Yeah.
I got a couple of FOIAs recently where they're like, you filed this request 3 years ago. Do you still want it? Let us know within a week or we will remove it forever. And I'm like, oh my God, like, why would you think that just because you took forever that I don't want this anymore? And one time I missed a deadline and I had to refile, which was really annoying because they were like, oh, you didn't respond immediately, so therefore we decided we didn't want, or they were trying to get me to, what they'll do sometimes if you ask for a lot of data is they'll try to get you to narrow it down. Which is fine, you know, it'll help them get it to you quicker, and if you only need a smaller amount of data, then that's great. But like, I didn't want it narrowed down. But the choices were, do you want it narrowed down, or do you want us not to do anything? And I'm like, no. And because I didn't respond within a week, I had to refile. It's annoying.
Cool. Any other questions? Oh, yeah, you can toss that over if you want. Cool.
All right, so with the recent Jonathan Scott and Beijing misinformation campaign, do you think that there should be a vetting process for journalists wanting to reach out to any security researcher wanting to just talk to press and vice versa?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, so this is a story that was in Wired Business, and I want to point out that it was in the business section. Usually when, I've noticed that when there are stories that seem a little off in Wired, they're not in the security section, even if they are security stories, and that's happened a bunch of times. But yeah, I absolutely think if somebody wants to interview you for a story, you should vet that person. You should look at their clips. You can look at their tweets, their website, whatever. Like, you shouldn't talk to, I do this too when journalists want to interview me. I make sure that, like, I don't want to say anything in an article that ends up being wrong because it makes me look bad. So yeah, I think there should be a vetting process, but I don't know if people always know exactly what to look for. And yeah, I didn't really read that story very closely yet, but it is on our list of candidates for next year. But I know there was like a lot of people that were pushing back on it pretty aggressively on Twitter, and I was like, oh yeah, this story is probably sketchy, but I haven't looked at it closely myself. But I will say that sometimes people don't like journalists and like are mean to them on Twitter because they're good at their jobs. So if you're like, oh, I don't want to talk to this journalist because people are yelling at them, that's not always accurate. And it happens that it's more often women journalists where people are like, oh yeah, I really don't like this journalist, blah, blah, blah. And like sometimes when you kind of, peel the layers of the onion, so to speak, it's like they wrote an investigative story that made a company mad, or they made a hacker mad because they told the truth about them or whatever. And so, yeah, it's just things to look at when you're sketching that out. Another thing you can do if you're a little nervous about talking to people on the record is you can ask them to email you questions, and some people will let you do that, and then you can like have your responses sent back to them. So then you're less likely to be misquoted. It doesn't allow them to it's not as good for the journalists because they can't ask follow-up questions and like get good conversation going, but Like sometimes that's what you got to do. And then another thing you can do that some people will let you do is to review your own quotes. And not everybody's allowed to do this, but you can ask them, like, if you're planning on using any quotes, can I review them and the context they're in or whatever. Almost nobody will let you see the article in advance. A lot of people ask for that, and like almost nobody will do that because it's kind of a conflict of interest, and weird things can happen when people try to preempt a story or just, I don't know. Most people will not let you do that, and if you're really lucky, it's a site that has fact checkers, so they will call you and verify your quotes and ask you a few questions. So, but yeah, definitely you should do vetting of anybody you talk to.
Cool. Any other questions? All right. Oh, yeah.
Don't throw anything at me.
Okay.
I'm just going to scream it.
Yeah.
What trends do you dread will be still on the docket for 2022, or what new trends are you fearing even more?
Yeah, you can take. I have a follow-up, but yeah. go
Okay.
ahead.
Okay, so the question was, what new trends are we afraid will be on the docket next year? And I think it's going to be blockchain.
Yeah, I was gonna say.
I think it's going to be blockchain and NFTs. But yeah, I think there's probably going to still be more like this breaks encryption. I feel like people have a lot of difficulty with understanding how encryption works. And one thing that bothers me personally is some of these bills and laws that are constantly being tried, like the Earn It Act, where people are like, we need to break encryption to protect children, which is actually a more nuanced conversation than they would make it seem. And so yeah, I think that'll probably be on there too. Yeah, that's fine, I guess.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's literally what I was gonna say. Is I think that we're seeing the growth of like overly complex like Web3 ecosystems, and reporting on that is going to be intrinsically difficult because even the developers that are working on that don't necessarily know how it works. So that's going to lead to some confusion, unfortunately. Oh yeah, what's? It's coming in pretty low, actually. Oh, cool.
If you make a FOIA request, leave the company, and it goes through, do you lose the ability to get that information?
It still goes to the address that you had it delivered to, and then I awkwardly pick up a letter from the CIA from the front desk. I'm like, what's going on, guys? That's what happens, or at least that's what happened the one time a colleague of mine did that, and then I was just like, I'm confused.
You can actually call the office and talk to a person, and some of the people processing these requests are good and will work with you and are not trying to sideline you. They're just kind of overworked. But I usually do it over email. Well, I do a lot through Muckrock, which you do have to pay for after a certain amount of requests, but it's easier for me to have it all in one space. I'm not filing crazy amounts, but I try to get them to email me things instead of mailing them because I want it in electronic form. It just makes it easier to search, and I'm gonna have to scan it anyway. But yeah, I guess you could try to give them a new address, but I usually give them my email anyway. And hope that they'll process it electronically.
Cool. Any other? Oh yeah, one here. There you go.
How do you go about determining what kind of FOIA request, like when you realize, hey, there's a story, I just need to get FOIA request in to back it up? How do you go about that?
You have an answer.
Okay, so how do you go about deciding what to FOIA? There's a really good book called The Art of Access by David Cullens. But I don't know, like for me, sometimes I'll see something that looks interesting. Like I'll be like, there was a talk about incels at the Air Force or something. I should FOIA that to see if they have any documents surrounding that. Or sometimes I'll look for complaints, like FCC or FTC complaints around something, or and try to get more information on that. I don't know. I FOIA'd for Black Lives Matter stuff around Phoenix because I'm like, I want to see what the internal communication is, and of course that was I had to narrow it by year and keywords and stuff like that. But yeah, you can kind of FOIA anything. It's really fun. Muckrock has a lot of different samples, and I've done that too. I looked at what people FOIA'd in California and was like, oh, I'll FOIA this for Arizona. So for me, I was doing a lot of police surveillance. I wanted to see how are automated license plate readers being used in Arizona and all these different police jurisdictions, and I'm going to FOIA all of them and compare it. And it took forever, but I did write an article about that as a freelancer. But yeah, it kind of depends on what you're looking for. But yeah, there's some really good books out there. There's FOIAs that you can kind of copycat or get ideas off of. And then there's also books out there that show you like what actually produces a document, because that's the actual documents that you're going to be trying to get. And you can kind of try to figure that out for your story. And we have 5 more minutes, so we have time for maybe like 2 or 3 more questions.
Yeah.
I will pontificate about FOIA a little bit more. The cool thing about FOIA is that if you have documents, you don't necessarily need a source. You can have a source comment on the documents, but you have like actual evidence of something in a file, which is really valuable as a journalist, instead of just people speculating.
Cool. Well, if anybody does have any follow-up questions, you can drop us a line. This is our contact info, email address, and Twitter handles. And yeah, thanks for coming to our talk, y'all.